Disclaimer. You're watching this because last Friday, January 30th, 2026, 100 Canadian auto workers lost their jobs when General Motors shut down the third shift at its Oshawa, Ontario plant. But here's what didn't make the American headlines. On that same day, while workers were clearing out lockers, Canada's industry minister stepped in front of cameras and delivered a message no U.S. automaker expected to hear. She said, "We're taking our money back." Not a request, not a warning, a demand. And she wasn't talking about minor penalties or paperwork fees. She was talking about hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, money Canada had poured into General Motors plants under one condition, that Canadian jobs would be protected. Those jobs were just erased anyway. This isn't a labor dispute. This isn't a strike. This isn't political theater. This is the moment Canada stopped behaving like America's manufacturing backroom. And General Motors just became the first company caught on the wrong side of a strategy Washington never saw coming. Because while U.S. automakers were quietly pulling out, Japan was moving in, and almost no one noticed, until now. What if I told you that while American automakers are abandoning Canada to chase tariff exemptions and political favors in Washington, Japanese manufacturers are doing the opposite? They're not only staying, they're expanding. And what if the key to understanding Canada's economic future is in a T in Washington or Beijing, but in the quiet boardrooms of Toyota and Honda? To understand how we got here, you need to know one uncomfortable truth. The betrayal didn't begin on January 30th, 2026. It began decades ago, when Canda made a deal it thought would last forever. A Faustian bargain. Canada would become the low-cost, reliable manufacturing hub for American corporations. In return, those corporations would provide jobs, stability, and access to the U.S. market. For a generation, the deal appeared to work. In 1965, the Auto Pact created a deeply integrated North American automotive industry. Parts crossed the border without friction. Vehicles flowed freely. Detroit invested billions in Ontario. Cities like Oshawa, Windsor, and Ingersoll became synonymous with auto manufacturing. Entire families built multi-generational careers on the assembly line. But here's what economics textbooks rarely tell you. Dependency is not partnership. And when the rules change, the dependent party has no leverage. The numbers tell the story better than any politician ever could. In 2016, the Detroit Three, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, accounted for 56% of all vehicles produced in Canada. By 2025, that number had collapsed to just 23%. That isn't a decline. That's a structural abandonment. Over the same period, auto assembly employment fell from more than 32,000 workers to under 24,000, and that's before the tariff-driven cuts of 2025 and 2026. And no company embodies this betrayal more clearly than General Motors. On May 10th, 2025, GM announced it would eliminate the third shift at the Oshawa assembly plant, citing forecasted demand and the evolving trade environment. Let me translate that corporate language. Donald Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles, and GM decided that protecting access to the U.S. market mattered more than protecting Canadian jobs. The third shift directly employed about 500 GM workers, but automotive layoffs don't stop at the factory gate. When an assembly shift disappears, the damage ripples outward. Seat manufacturers, wiring harness suppliers, windshield producers, truck drivers, logistics coordinators, maintenance crews. According to the union representing these workers, up to 200 jobs across the supply chain were wiped out. The layoffs were initially scheduled for late 2025, then quietly delayed to January the 30th, 2026, supposedly to give governments time to negotiate a deal with Washington that might save the jobs. That deal never came. At 6:30 a.m. on a freezing January morning, workers clocked out for the last time. Some had spent more than 30 years inside that plant. Others were young workers who believed they had finally secured stable, middle-class lives. Many walked away with an empty feeling in their stomachs and no clear future. And here's where the story turns from tragic to obscene. In the same year, GM laid off more than 1,000 Canadians. The company reported over $12 billion in pre-tax profits. Not losses, not hardship. Profits. And what did GM do with that money? They didn't reinvest in Canadian workers. They didn't honor subsidy commitments. They didn't protect communities. They launched a $6 billion share buyback and boosted dividends to shareholders. Let that sink in. Canadian jobs were cut. Wall Street was rewarded. This wasn't a company in distress. This was a calculated decision. And it gets worse. GM didn't reduce production. It moved it. The Oshawa plant builds the Chevrolet Silverado. So does GM's facility in Fort Wayne, Indiana. As Oshawa lost shifts, Fort Wayne added workers. Those weren't lost jobs. They were relocated jobs, shifted south to appease a U.S. president threatening tariffs. That's when the illusion finally shattered. American automakers were never loyal to Canada. They were loyal to leverage. And for the first time in decades, Canada decided not to swallow it. Because January 30th, 2026 wasn't just the day GM laid off workers. It was the day Canada stopped pretending this was just business as usual. While General Motors was retreating, something else was happening, quietly, deliberately, and strategically. Japanese automakers weren't leaving. They weren't threatening layoffs on earnings calls. They weren't floating trial balloons about rebalancing North American capacity. They weren't running to Washington, begging for exemptions. They were holding the line. And in some cases, they were doubling down. By 2025, Toyota and Honda accounted for more than 3/4 of all vehicle production in Canada. That number matters, because it didn't happen by accident. It happened during the same years American automakers were slashing output, shuttering shifts, and treating Canada like a contingency plan instead of a partner. Toyota alone employs thousands of Canadians across its Ontario facilities in Cambridge and Woodstock. Honda anchors entire regional economies around its Alliston plant. These companies face the same headwinds as GM, the same tariffs, the same political chaos, the same global supply chain disruptions. But they responded differently. Why? Because they don't think in quarters. They think in decades. To understand what's happening now, you need to understand the fundamental difference between American and Japanese corporate behavior. American automakers are publicly traded giants locked into a brutal cycle of quarterly earnings pressure. Every 3 months, results are scrutinized. Miss expectations, and stock prices fall. When stock prices fall, activist investors emerge. Boards panic. Executives are forced to cut costs fast. Plants become line items. Workers become variables. Communities become expendable. Japanese automakers operate under a different philosophy entirely. Quarterly performance matters, but it isn't everything. Corporate reputation, workforce stability, and long-term brand strength carry real weight. Plants are not disposable cost centers. They are strategic assets. Toyota and Honda didn't abandon Canada because doing so would weaken their long-term positioning in North America. Instead, they adjusted production mixes, diversified export destinations, and absorbed short-term inefficiencies to preserve long-term resilience. That decision wasn't sentimental. It was coldly rational. Because the Canadian plants operated by Toyota and Honda are not second-tier facilities, they are centers of excellence. The Honda Civic built in Alliston isn't some overflow model. It has been one of the best-selling cars in Canada for more than 2 decades. The Toyota RAV4, produced in Ontario, is one of the best-selling SUVs in all of North America. These vehicles command premium prices, they generate strong margins, and they are consistently ranked among the highest quality vehicles in the world. Japanese automakers invested heavily to make Canadian plants indispensable, not optional. That investment paid off. For decades, Canada hasn't just consumed Japanese brand vehicles, it has exported them. In fact, since the early 1990s, Canada has exported more Japanese brand vehicles than it has imported from Japan, the United States, and other countries combined. Millions of units. That's manufacturing sovereignty hiding in plain sight. And Ottawa noticed. For years, Canadian policymakers assumed loyalty from American automakers was automatic. That assumption collapsed in real time during the tariff crisis. So in late 2025, Canada's industry minister quietly boarded a plane to Asia. Not for optics, not for headlines, for leverage. Japan, South Korea, boardrooms, not podiums. The meetings weren't about photo ops, they were about commitments. Battery supply chains, defense manufacturing, aerospace cooperation, long-term industrial alignment. The message was simple, and it was deliberate. If you invest in Canada for the long term, Canada will invest in you. And if you betray us, there will be consequences. When the minister returned home, policy followed rhetoric. Subsidies were no longer blank checks. Job guarantees would be enforceable. Clawbacks would include interest. Compliance audits would be routine. This wasn't protectionism, it was accountability. For decades, Canada had subsidized foreign corporations on trust. That trust was abused. Now it would be enforced. At the same time, Canada sharpened a tool that Washington had underestimated: targeted retaliation. Not blunt tariffs, not trade war theatrics, precision. Tariffs and regulatory pressure aimed at politically sensitive exports, automotive components, intermediate goods, supply chain choke points, economic judo. You don't meet force with force, you redirect momentum, you let your opponents stumble under their own weight. The United States depends heavily on Canadian auto parts, aluminum castings, electronic modules, advanced materials. Disrupt those flows, and American plants feel it immediately. And quietly, Ottawa began encouraging Canadian suppliers to diversify away from American customers. Asia, Europe, new EV entrants, new markets. If GM wanted to move production south, fine. But the ecosystem that supported it would no longer be guaranteed. Then came the final lever: critical minerals, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earths. These aren't just commodities. They are the building blocks of the electric future. Batteries, motors, advanced electronics, defense systems. Canada holds massive reserves of them. For years, policymakers assumed those resources would naturally flow south to American processors and manufacturers. No longer. New agreements tied mineral extraction to domestic processing and job creation. If you wanted Canadian lithium, you needed to refine it in Canada. If you wanted Canadian nickel, you needed to build batteries here. In late 2025, Canada signed landmark agreements with Asian partners to build battery processing facilities on Canadian soil. These facilities would source Canadian minerals and feed directly into Canadian manufacturing operations. Noticeably absent from those deals was General Motors. GM had bet that Canada would remain passive. That assumption proved fatal. Suddenly, European automakers started calling. Asian EV manufacturers began exploring Canadian assembly options. New players saw what Detroit missed. Canada wasn't just a market, it was a platform. History will record January 30th, 2026 as the day General Motors saved money by shifting jobs to Indiana. But Canada will remember it differently. It will remember that day as the moment it stopped asking for permission. The branch plant era, where Canada existed to serve foreign decisions, is dying. In its place, a more assertive Canada is emerging, one that rewards loyalty, punishes betrayal, and understands its own leverage. This fight isn't just about tariffs or factories, it's about sovereignty, economic sovereignty, industrial sovereignty, political sovereignty, and it has only just begun. If this breakdown helped you, hit like, subscribe to the channel Economic Records, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. See you in the next one.